And so it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Thibaud Griessinger holds a PhD in cognitive neuroscience and is now consultant for the Ecological Transition and researcher at the ACTE Lab, an independent behavioral science team he founded that aims to explore the cognitive and environmental factors that modulate individual and collective behavior and use this knowledge to help transform lifestyles and organizations. The title of his presentation today is From Individual Action to Systemic Change. How can cognitive science contribute to the emergence of more sustainable and resilient social organization?
So, hi everybody. So I guess it's morning for you. So good morning. It's a bit later here in France, in Paris. So I'm like Alexia said. Actually, we did our studies together. So I'm really pleased to see you again today. I finished my PhD in cognitive science a few years ago, and since then I'm trying to understand how we could actually use cognitive science and behavioral science in general in order to help actors on the fields, so the state, the regions, NGOs, corporations, to move towards more sustainable organizations or more sustainable society. So I'm not saying that cognitive science is the key to solve it all and is the key to, is the perfect solution, but I think there is much we could actually do and contribute to. And so I'm guessing the goal of my presentation is to show you how I see things and how we try to tackle those issues at the ACTE Lab with my colleagues who are also researchers or PhD or students in cognitive science. So the main question we try to answer, and we're at the beginning, so this is early thoughts. I might disagree with myself in a few years, so it's fine if you disagree with me, and I'll be super happy to discuss it at the end. So this is work in progress, let's say. And so the main question we try to address is this one, is how can behavioral science facilitate deep and just transitions? So I had it just because often we forget this piece of the equation, piece of the puzzle, that doesn't have to be super efficient and fast transition. It also has to not leave people on the side, and to make sure that everybody is actually included in this thinking. I guess you had classes before, or talks or conferences by people working in academia. So I wanted to give you a slide of presentation to explain to you where we stand and our point of view on this question. So if you divide the words in two different parts, on one side you have academia and cognitive sciences, like research on the human and also animal mind. I guess a lot of speakers were psychologists, social psychologists, neuroscientists, maybe sociologists, economists, maybe working in academia. And we're a bit more on the side of the actors of the ecological transition. So we work along with the states, cities, research institutes, NGOs, and our goal is to help these guys. So those logos here are French logos, but basically you get the idea. It's just examples. So all these different organizations could be public, private, non-profit, trying to push in the direction of a more sustainable society. We're trying to help them facilitate, have more impactful action and facilitate their job. And so the question we have, and that's the goal of the ACTE Lab, is to understand how this knowledge that we have on human mind, on social and group dynamics, could be helpful to those guys here so that they could be more efficient in the work they do. So that's basically what we try to do. And our big question is, how could we make a bridge or build a bridge in between those two worlds who are not super well, they don't really know each other, and they don't communicate so much. So our goal is to try to find some common projects and common language, so we have a shared culture, let's say. And our approach is therefore action-oriented. So our goal is not really to do fundamental or basic research. It's more to do some action research projects with the people on the field in order to understand in real life, how this knowledge could be applied. And what I'm going to present to you today is therefore a point of view or perspective that I have on these questions, being a bit on this side of the line in between the two worlds. so the big questions we want to address is how can cognitive and behavioral science help tackle the challenges of the ecological transition and sustainable development? And before talking a bit about how we do that and how we could apply this, this knowledge, I wanted to share with you a bit how we got, how we tackled this problem and what was the original thoughts that we had. At the beginning, to me, it appeared to be a sort of paradox, because on the one side, you had like a large consensus of scientists talking about how human activities and the dependency to fossil fuel, in the case of climate change, was actually emitting a lot of greenhouse gases and warming the surface of the globe. And some researchers were talking about Anthropocene even to emphasize the fact that human was really at the core and at the center of these environmental issues. And so when we talked about climate change, it was the human side was at the cause of the climate change mainly. I wanted to show you here like few other pictures because we tend to forget these two other dimensions. And then when I talk, at least when I talk about the environmental crisis and the ecological transition, I talk not only about reducing the impact of human activities on climate, but also reducing the impact of human activities on biodiversity and also reducing what we emit in terms of pollution, air pollution, water pollution and land pollution. So the ecological transition equation is quite large and complex because it's not only about reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's also to reduce our global impact on our environment from which we rely on. And so when we got interested in those questions, of course, it was really impressive to see how deep and profound our impact was and how entangled our lifestyles and mode of organization was with these issues. And I just wanted to share with you this article I've seen and read recently that emphasized the fact that even if we're far into the road of high impact societies, there is still some room for change and there is still some important choices to make. And so when you put the two pictures together, you have on one side the idea that we don't have the choice but change, and on the other side that we still have the choice to change. And for the rest of my talk, I will mainly talk about climate change and CO2 emissions and carbon footprints, because that's mostly what we focus on, and also what the intersection between behavioral science and environmental issues are focused on carbon emission. But that's not the only issue, and I guess you can apply what I'm gonna say to the other issues, but we could talk about that at the end. So when we see this idea, when we have this idea of reducing our impact and reducing our carbon emissions, what came a lot researching that was the idea that technology was a solution. So we could actually change every piece of our societal organization in order to reduce its global impact. So we can decarbonize the energy, we can change our individual cars to electric cars, we can be less dependent to fossil fuel and so on. And I lay down here the concept of smart grid. I think that encapsulates quite well this idea that when we tackle these issues, a lot of engineers thought about technology and what could be done at the technological level. But when you go a bit further, you realize, and I think this quote by a French engineer I like a lot really captures it, that technology is not enough, because technology relies on how people use it. And if you develop a technology and people use it wrong or badly or don't use it at all, actually, the impact of your technology on what you try to achieve, let's say reducing carbon emission, will be none, and it could actually be negative. That's what we call negative rebound effects. So this guy says solutions should be socio-technical, not only technical. So that's the first bit of talking about the human side of, the human part of climate change, not only on the cause part, but on the solution part. So first, trying to think about how people use technology and think about how people behave when you're gonna deploy and develop a technology. And I mentioned here a study that came out recently in Germany that shows that the huge investment that has been made in renovating buildings, so it's something like 300 billion euros since 2010, had almost no effects. So they try to reduce energy consumption by 15%, and actually they failed to do that. And one reason that was written by the authors is, one possible reason is the famous rebound effect. So in better isolated housing, occupants will have improved their comfort by increasing the heating set points. So basically you had a use that was compensating the possible reduction of carbon emission coming from the technology. So you see a perfect example here of how taking into account the behavior along with the technology is important if you only think about technological issues. Another part of the problem is that technology is not enough. And there is also an imperative to change our lifestyles and to develop differently, like the WWF put it quite nicely. And I put it here, an image from a scenario that has been developed by a French think tank, which is called Negawatts, that that says that basically renewables and technology should be the last piece of the puzzle, the last priority. The first priority, if you want to achieve like the Paris Agreement, for instance, in terms of carbon reduction, will be to reduce our individual footprint, to be more sufficient, so to focus our needs on more decarbonated activities, and then to be more efficient in our ways to use energy. And at the end, on the part of the energy consumption, you cannot reduce after being more sufficient in energy and more efficient, will be then replaced by renewables. So they kind of reverse the way usually people thought about these issues, saying that technology will be the last piece of the puzzle, and first we should focus on changing our lifestyles. And there are studies now that are coming out and trying to compare if we want to achieve some, let's say, carbon emission reduction here in agriculture and in the food domain, what part of the technology, what part of the solution should be technological, and what part of the solution should be at the behavioral level. And you see on this picture that if you look at the carbon or the greenhouse gas emissions, the green part is the proportion of change that should be on the diets, on the behavior. And you see that technology, according to their models and their estimation, is actually a small part of the change which is needed to reduce the greenhouse gas emission of the food consumption. I think it's in the US. And here you have different criteria, which is not just greenhouse emission. You have all other types of environmental impacts. So studies coming out saying technology will not be sufficient, and we should, in that case, shift diets and therefore change our lifestyles. One problem with, and I think this article that came out recently is quite interesting. It tries to compare different scenarios of carbon emission reduction and trying to see how much lifestyle change is taken into account in those scenarios across the globe. And they compare different scenarios, trying to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And they show that first, lifestyles is quite neglected compared to technological changes in these scenarios that has been developed by different countries or think tanks or NGOs. And also one explanation for that is that the integration of lifestyles or behavioral change might pose a potential challenge to the solidity and reliability of pathway production methodology, which therefore condition their policy relevance. So basically what they're saying is that the policymakers or the engineers or people creating those scenarios to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 neglect the lifestyle part because it's too uncertain how to quantify, and therefore they focus more on what is easily quantifiable, therefore the technology part. And I will come back to that point at the end of my talk, because I think focusing on behavior is important also in terms of how we think about those issues and the types of strategies that we can come up with in order to reduce our environmental impact. So that was the first piece of the puzzle, saying that the environmental impact that we have is quite big, and the behavioral part is not just a detail in the big equation. It's a huge parameter, either on the technological side or either because changing lifestyles is one major lever to actually reduce our impact. And that led to what the work we have done. I'm going to present you some different projects, but basically what I'm going to take a message is this one. For now, what we realize is that the cognitive science and behavioral science could be used to tackle these challenges. First, it could be used to increase the impact of environmental actions and policies that are deployed by the state or the corporations, for instance, but it could also contribute to develop more adjusted and efficient strategies. So not just only having more efficient actions in terms of changing people behavior and lifestyles, but also thinking differently about lifestyles and behavioral change in order to develop some strategies that are more efficient and adjusted. And a last piece I will try to develop at the end is that I think now that cognitive science has a potential also to open new perspective and new paths to think about the ecological transition. And I will get to that at the very end. So we'll focus on the first point, is how we could use behavioral science to actually increase the impact of environmental actions and policies. So to go back to my previous point, when you think about reducing the impacts and the behavioral part of it, the behavioral parameter of the equation, what comes usually is what we call pro-environmental behaviors. So I think you've seen this term in other presentations. PEB, pro-environmental behaviors, is basically how we link behavioral science and all behavior and environmental issues. And pro-environmental behaviors basically are behaviors, usually individual behaviors, that are well described, well understood. And the idea is, so you have, for instance, trying to avoid packaging, recycling, reduce eating, biking, and so on. So all those actions that we are now well aware of are what we call pro-environmental behavior. And that they have been found using these methods. So here you see the carbon footprint of one average French citizen. And when you take the carbon footprint of one average French citizen, you can see how much of the footprint is allocated to transportation, to housing, to consumption. Could be like clothes, could be electronic material, also to food. You see that one big chunk, the dark blue, is dedicated to the emission that are due to meat consumption, and also sorts of services. So the idea of pro-environmental behavior is basically, if taking the car account for a huge part of individual carbon footprints, therefore you should switch away from taking the car in order to reduce the footprint. And so you obtain this type of graph with the order of magnitudes. It is quite easy for a French citizen, average French citizen, I will talk about that a bit later, it's not the case for everybody, to reduce their carbon footprints by going vegetarian and reducing meat consumption. This is a huge part of the carbon emission. By biking for short journeys, car sharing for all journeys instead of taking your individual cars. SUV, of course, is way worse. Giving up flying, buying less clothes, and so on and so forth. So you see specific behaviors that if you change them at the end, if you like to, if you change all these types of actions or behavior, then you will be able to decrease already your average carbon footprint by 1/5 in order to target what is needed to reach the Paris Agreement. In order to do so, the question is, how can you actually convince or push people to reduce their, to change their behavior in order to reduce their global carbon footprints? And if you take the case of public policy or policy making, because we work a lot with public decision makers, but the same applies to private actions or NGOs, any type of action. So public policies, they have different means of actions. They could have the law, norms, rules and regulation, taxes, fine, incentives. They could also inform, education, all sorts of services. Those are their levers. And each of this lever has one goal, is to change behavior. Could be to protect your own health, protect the health of relatives. If the goal is to incite you to smoke less, for instance, they could increase the price of the pack of cigarettes. They could fine you if you smoke inside, and so on and so forth. They could also run a huge campaign to tell people how dangerous it is to smoke, especially for the babies, and etc. And when the public policymakers are using these tools, if they don't take into account the behavior, and we see that a lot, you could have different side effects. If you don't take into account why do people smoke, or why don't they stop smoking, for instance, in the case of the smoking behavior. One consequence of not taking into account the behavior and why people act that way and what could be done to push them in the other direction is what we talked about before, which is negative rebound effects on targeted behavior or use. So you have, for instance, campaigns that were trying to push teenagers to stop smoking, saying that smoking is bad, and you could observe in some studies some rebound effects that shows that those campaigns had the opposite effect, and having teenagers wanting to smoke more because it was for a forbidden behavior, for instance. In that case, the lever you activate has the opposite effect of what you try to achieve, because you didn't take into account that teenagers, for instance, are risk seekers. One other consequence of that is just rejection or insufficient engagement. I think you've heard in France a couple of years ago about the Yellow Vest movement. That was so the trigger of this social movement was the carbon tax that was implemented in France, and the way it was implemented led to a feeling of unfairness. This idea that they were stolen money, that was unfair, that the money wasn't used in order to for the ecological transition, the money was just a way for the state to get more money, and so on and so forth. So the way it was implemented and the way it was communicated didn't take into account the people that they were targeting, and it led to rejection. Another consequence is just a lack of efficiency or lack of impact. So the tax you put in place or the campaign you run has just no impact. Of course, you have to measure the impact to know that it has no impact. And that is one major issue we have, at least in France. Usually policymakers don't really evaluate the policies they're implementing. I know in other countries, it's also the case. So one consequence is just you spend money trying to push people to smoke less, for instance, and it has just no impact on their smoking behavior. You could also have some collateral effects. So you're targeting one type of population to push them to smoke less, and the campaign you run, because it's at the national scale and it goes on TV, for instance, has an effect on other people and other behavior, and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of consequences that could come up from not taking into account the behavior in developing or designing environmental actions or environmental policies. Of course, here I took the case of smoking because it was easier to understand. And so that led a lot of policymakers to think about how we could actually implement the behavioral science into the policymaking. And this European Commission report says, it summarizes it all. It says the effectiveness of public policies often depends on how people react to it and the extent to which people's real behavior is taken into account when designing policies. So they really emphasize the fact that behavior should be at the core of thinking about policymaking, thinking about action, especially environmental actions. So if you go back to the main question that we're interested in, which is the ecological transition, you see that we tried many ways to push people in the right direction, right being adopting some behaviors that they will agree with in principle, but not doing actually. And so you have this survey that is actually, I think they run it every year since 20 years now. And this one is the 2019, I think, edition. And so they asked the French, so a representative sample of the French population, if they actually sort waste, buy seasonal food, turn off appliances, no longer fly, so sort of pro-environmental behavior. And you see that some behavior, they answer that they're doing it already. So almost 80% of the people that were interviewed said that they were already sorting waste. But when we go to biking or walking instead of driving, or reducing meat consumption, or using public transportation, for instance, you see that this number is much, much smaller. But the interesting part here is the part in blue, in light blue, when they ask them for each action, not just if they were doing it already, but if it could be done quite easily. And you see that for a lot of this behavior, they answer that, yeah, they could do it easily, but they just don't do it already. And the red part is I could do it, but it's not that easy. And the red part is I cannot do it. So what you see in light colors is basically a margin of maneuver, a margin of action. And you see that people, they agree with it. They want to do it when you ask them, but they have hard time to actually do it. So you could actually think about some actions or policies that will actually accompany or facilitate the change to push people to adopt those pro-environmental behaviors in order to reduce their carbon footprint in that case. So how do we do that? One way to do it is, I mean, that's how it was done at the first place. And I think you're quite familiar with it already, but I'm gonna explain to you quite fast, is to take into account why don't people change? Why is the fact that people, they want to change their behavior, but they cannot, they actually don't do it, what we call the awareness action gap, or the intention action gap, when they have the intention to do so, but they fail to do so. And you could look at what the cognitive science or behavioral science has to say about that, what makes people, prevent people to actually change. And it's quite fast. You have some concepts like cognitive biases, for instance, that show up, saying, so basically our cognition has some properties, and the way we think or reason or behave or memorize could actually, in some situation, push us in the wrong direction. So it can bias our decision-making process, or it can bias our choice, what people call the cognitive biases. I don't really like the term, but the idea is this one. The way we perceive the world the way we perceive the world sometimes lead us to make some inaccurate judgments or inaccurate estimations. The way we memorize some events, or we memorize some information. If I show you an information saying that you should actually reduce your meat consumption, when you think about it much later when you're at the restaurant, you could just not think about it, or you could have twisted the way this information was presented to you in the first place. And so that could lead to inappropriate behavior, for instance. So I'm not gonna tell you all the biases that exist, because there are more than 200 biases that have been described. And I just put it here, a picture of a codex that summarizes all the cognitive biases you could find. The problem with that is that you have at the end a list of biases, so it doesn't tell you much about human behavior and the complexity and the dynamic of behavioral change. But that's one way to have an idea of what could actually prevent someone to actually change, even if they want to. And so this knowledge of cognitive properties, let's say, properties about our cognition, has been implemented into policymaking through what has been called the nudge or nudging. And so the idea is to use some basic knowledge on cognition, how we interpret information, how we decide, in what context or which context, what context do we decide, how depending on how information is presented, how much we're going to pay attention to it. And so you have at the end some sort of keys or insights that could be used in order to improve the way we communicate information, improve the way we organize public space, for instance, where we put the bins, could actually, the colors of the bins, for instance, could actually affect the how much attention you pay to it, and therefore your willingness to put your garbage into the bin and not on the floor. I mean, you could use this basic knowledge on cognition to develop what has been called nudges. So here I gave you some examples. In Paris here, you had some ashtray on the public space where you could vote in between two different famous people, I think. So that pushes you to, since it's quite attractive and playful, that pushes you because you want to vote for one of the two, Star Wars or Star Trek, or I don't know what the other is. Therefore, it activates certain behavior. It pushes you to put your cigarette in the bin and not on the floor. But it could also be used to make your electricity bill more easily understandable. So you could actually see what you should change in order to decrease your electricity consumption. So that is more related to the energy transition. Depending on how you present the bill, it could change it could activate some change or not. And other types of strategies or nudge strategies has been used, for instance, by the French Ministry of Environment when they used influencers or messengers, so people famous on YouTube, for instance, to deliver some messages to their audience on recycling, on sorting waste, and so on and so forth. And the idea was that by telling the youth what to do through the voice of people they had trust and they had respect for, could actually convince them to actually engage in such behavior. So that what we call green nudges. So those are tricks using some basic knowledge on cognition in order to develop some actions or policies or public furniture, for instance, that will actually push people to reduce their environmental impact. I put it here, a more complex image. So this one is from the Behavioral Insights team, which is a consulting agency originally based in London, where they give some sort of insights in order to take into account some basic knowledge on cognition to develop communication campaigns or to develop some strategies. Here is a more complex, let's say, picture that says basically the same, that has been developed by the OECD. When you have some insights about if you think when people are forgetting information or they're overlooking information that you're giving to them that is supposed to trigger the change in their behavior, or they're multitasking and therefore they don't really pay attention to it, you could find some ways to increase their attention, like make it more relevant, seize their attention, plan or anticipate their inattention patterns. And so this diagram gives you some insights you could already use if you're a policymaker in order to improve your actions. So this was like level 1 of how behavioral science has been used in order to increase some actions or some policies to push people in the right direction concerning the environmental issues. The problem with the nudges is that it has some limited effects. So this review, for instance, has shown that they looked at many articles that were implementing the nudge strategies and evaluating their impact and trying to do a meta-analysis of is nudge effective. And they show that, so this type of nudge could be commitments, default option, messenger, like I've said, playing with social norms, for instance, showing the electricity consumption of your neighbors could actually push you to reduce your own electricity consumption, priming, science, education, and so on. And so the way that it's usually done is that you have a domain or a behavior to change, meat consumption, land management, transportation choice. You use one of the techniques that I've shown before, one of the nudge, one of the tricks, let's say, and you see what happens. And at the end, you have some types of nudges that are effective, or at least they're promising in terms of efficiency, some that have mixed effects, and some that have no effects. And at the end, the nudge strategies, when it's done this way, has a limited effect. And one reason for that, I mean, there are many reasons for that, but I think one reason is if you want to use this basic knowledge on cognition without taking into account how specific a behavior is, not taking into account the main obstacles someone has in order to change their behavior. So if you use a tool without knowing what you use it for, therefore it is unlikely that the strategy will actually work. So the first advice will be to use the right tool and to do so to identify the main obstacles of the behavior change. A second explanation or hypothesis why these strategies usually are not working so well is that it relies on intuition. So policymakers, when you think about what prevents people from taking common transportation or eating less meat, for instance, they rely on their own empirical evidence, or their own expertise or what they've observed before, and not really on some objective sources of information, let's say. And so one way to get more effective nudges is to gather multiple information about the type of obstacles that the individuals are encountering, and evaluating the different sources given how credible they are. The third advice to increase this impact will be to actually focus on impact and to experiment or pilot different strategies, different ways of presenting information, different ways of trying to facilitate behavior change in order to see if it has some impact, or it could have some impact before deploying it at large scale. So it will save some money, of course, and it will be easier to adjust and adapt based on what you observe on the field. Because it's not because you know exactly, I mean, you know what prevents people to change, and you try to take that into consideration, that the solution you come up with will be efficient for sure, or impactful for sure, because it could interact with many other aspects of real life behavior, real life. And therefore, you must experiment first and evaluate the impact downstream. And a third advice for this nudge is not really on the same, I'll just put it here, is the ethics part of it. Because if you're not ensured that when you want to push people in the right direction, that what you think as being the right direction is actually what other people and the one you're trying to change their behavior is has actually the same idea of what is right. And so you have to make sure that there is a support or an intention first from the target audience or the population you're targeting. So this was for green nudges. So you use main, general knowledge about the human behavior, and you implement it into action. And a way to improve that is what has been called evidence-informed or evidence-based approaches. So the idea here is not to use broad knowledge about behavior and implement it into solutions or policies or actions, but basically to start from the problem. If you want to push people to take their bike more to go to work, for instance, you have to first try to understand in the specific field or territory for the specific population you're interested in, what are the obstacles, the barriers to change, trying to diagnose what is to diagnose what is the problem. In order to do so, you could use some literature review on what we call gray literature, reports that has been published already, literature in scientific literature, in behavioral science, in cognitive science, in order to understand, for instance, what makes people eat a certain type of food. It could be cultural, it could be habits, it could be preference, etc. So you first try to understand what prevents someone to change, and then to design a solution, trying to test it, and therefore, and then given the results to redefine, re-diagnose, and so on and so forth. So this is an approach that has been developed by the Behavioral Insights team, but also many governments, many behavioral insights units around the world, in France in particular. And here, you're not using just broad knowledge about how we perceive the world, how we choose or decide. You get interested in on the field, on the real people, what are the issues they're having, and trying to find some solutions to the issues they're having. Of course, you could do that without behavioral science. So designers, for instance, they do so. They interrogate people, they do surveys, they do focus groups, but people are not really good at introspecting and knowing exactly what are the mechanisms underneath and what are the reasons why they're not acting in the way they want to act. So that's the whole history of psychology, moving beyond introspection and implementing this knowledge about how habits are changing and how social norms are emerging, and what is the impact of imitation on your own behavior, given who you have around you, who is showing the lead, and so on and so forth. This specific knowledge in cognitive science could be implemented into the diagnostic in order to better understand what's going on and to find some solutions. So here it's in French, but basically I'm going to show you two quick projects. One with a region in France when we got interested in car sharing. And so we did extensive review of the literature. We then moved to the field. We did interviews with experts. We did surveys with the population of interest, focus groups. And at the end, we had the diagnostics. So what were the mechanisms underneath the practice of car sharing? And here you have, of course, two behavior. First, you should give away taking your car to go to work, for instance, and then take share a car with someone else. So you have different mechanisms that we have identified. Lack of, I don't know, could be like the social part is quite important in car sharing. So I could detail that if you want. It's in French, so it's quite hard for me to translate. But that one way to do it is to provide a precise diagnostic of what are the mechanisms that are preventing, cognitive and social mechanisms that are preventing people to give away driving the car by themselves to go to work, and move towards sharing a car with someone else in order to reduce the impact of the transportation and the carbon footprint on the transportation part. And from this diagnostic, you give to decision makers, and they base their decision making and their solutions, the solutions they will come up with based on this more precise knowledge than the one they have before, because usually, like I said, they rely on intuition or observations or some specific expertise, and they miss an important piece of the puzzle. Another way to use this behavioral science in order to improve the actions or policies is not just about diagnostic level. It's on the creating solutions and evaluating their impact. So here's the study we did. So the Behavioral Insights team did, and I helped them to run this project with the French government. We wanted to, so the French government wanted to create an index of reparability that indicates on each product how much each product is reparable. Easy to open and change some specific pieces by yourself instead of just buying a new one each time, which induces a lot of environmental impact. So this index of reparability, in order to develop it, you have to understand the relationship people have with the concept of reparability. And so we had two main points of diagnostic. First, we wanted to make sure that the key takeaway from reparability was clear and immediate, and to make the benefits to the individual salient. So people must be sure that they're not buying more reparable computer just because it's reparable, but because they could take some benefits out of it. Could be economic benefits, or it could be social benefits. So we developed different types of indexes. We run a randomized control trial to see the effect of each indexes on the choice behavior in real conditions on the website of a famous retailer. So we run a quantitative study. We also run a qualitative study. So we developed the different indexes in different, deployed the different indexes in different shops, and we went to encounter the sellers, the consumers, in order to understand if they saw the index in each of the condition, if they were interested in it, if they understood what the concept was about, and so on and so forth. And we did a pretest before, so a sort of pilot to pre-select some types of designs in order to make sure that we got this right. And then we analyze the results. And right now, this logo here, the visual, the one with the key, the rectangle one, is the one which is now implemented in France on the product since the beginning of the year. So in order to develop this action, which was to develop an index, we had to take into account how people were understanding the concept of reparability, what was the obstacles of taking into account this piece of information in order to make sure that what was developed at the scale of the country was actually the best we could have. So the first project was more about the diagnostic part. This one was more about design and the test part. And these are the two insights we could provide to these decision makers. Of course, here I talk about the public decision makers, but we work also with the NGOs to help them to be more efficient in their action and in their policies. So now that I've shown you that, so it was the first point, so increase the impact of environmental actions and policies, I think, and we think that behavioral science could be helpful to go a bit further than that. And one reason we wanted to go further than what is done quite well now and more and more in France, at least, to take into the behavior into the policy making, come from these types of critiques. So you see here critiques that has been written by sociologists in France 2 years ago. And they basically say that the nudge approach or changing individual behavior approach is not only limited in its impact, but it could also place too much responsibility on the individual and neglect some more political side of the issue or economic side of the issue. And so basically when you focus too much on the individual behavior, therefore you put all the responsibility of change on individual behavior, and you don't take into account that individuals might have limited action or limited margin of action, and you dismiss the need to actually convince big companies or convince elected mayors, for instance, to change their way of leading or deciding or whatever they do. And I think this critique is quite good. So in this article, they missed the critique about the nudge because they didn't take into account that now nudge or behavioral insights applied to policymaking is much more than just this type of nudge. Sorry, it's something much more complex and it's something which much deeper. But I think the point about individual responsibility is a fair point. And we're developing now some projects to try to use cognitive science in order to move beyond this idea of just pushing individual change. And I think this way of thinking about these issues could actually help decision makers to develop, or just actors of the ecological transition, develop more adjusted and efficient strategies, not just increase the impact of their actions that usually target individual behavior and usually target consumers' behavior. And there are 5 questions that I think that are important to take into account if you want to move from individual change to collective change, under the idea that there are people changing systems, and of course that it is really like a bottom-up approach. So you could change sociotechnical systems by changing the rules of the systems. That's totally fine, and I think what I'm going to present is not going against that. But you could also tackle the problem differently and think about systems composed by individuals and actors, stakeholders, and changing some behaviors might actually induce a more systemic change. And I think there are 5 ways to move beyond individual change to go to more impactful and collective change. So the first question we have to ask is, what is the margin of action of the people we are targeting? So for instance, if you want to change the behavior of me, for instance, if the city wants me to ride more and take my car less, they might develop some policies, taxes, communication. They could take into account how difficult it is for me to take the bike and not the car, and trying to understand what I've presented to you before. But they have to take into account that I might not have the luxury to actually change my behavior, and maybe I need my car so bad that at the end, it's not just a matter of motivation, it's not just a matter of habits or social norm, it's a matter of that I'm not able to do it. My margin of action, my margin of maneuver is too thin. And this picture is trying to encapsulate that. So you could look at individuals trying to give the right information to change their beliefs about how important it is to change their behavior. So they have the intention to change their behavior, let's say take the bike more, and then to implement that into an action. But this is this depends on an individual context. So personal history of someone, his level of education, his preferences, values, whatever. This depends on a social and cultural context. So social norms of my groups of friends, people I work with, my family, and so on and so forth. And this is embedded in a more economic or technical context. So where I live, the shops around me, how the roads are actually built. So my behavior is not just dependent of me, it depends on where I am situated and depending on my situation. So for instance, in Paris, you see the location of the zero waste shops. You see that the zero waste shops, which are needed if you want to avoid buying plastic packaging, are located in one part of the city, and you have huge part of the cities with not such shop. So for the people, for instance, living here, it's harder for them to actually buy in zero waste shop or to get rid of plastic packaging than people living here, because here they have easy access to shops that are already providing food not packaged. So you could go there with their own containers, just take the food out of the huge recipient, and it's much easier for them. So depending on where you live, you have more or less margin of maneuver. Then you have another component, which is your salary. If buying in such shops is expensive or more expensive than the other shops, then my margin of maneuver will depend on how rich I am and how much money I have to spend on food. And if buying packaged food is cheaper than buying an unpackaged food, and I don't have much money, therefore I will be constrained by my economy, and I will move. It will be easier for me to go for the packaged food. And you see that the level of salary is also connected to where you live. So you have areas that are more expensive. So therefore you have people, sides of Paris where people are richer than others because the apartments are much more expensive than in other areas. So that leads what we call social spatial inequalities. And in Paris, for instance, it has increased since 30 years now. And more there are inequalities, social spatial inequalities. So people with different salary more and more living together. So you have like inequalities could be seen on the map, and of course that constrains the supply. And these types of shops, for instance, are more in areas with people with some money, and areas with people with less money, you don't have these types of shops. So everything is interconnected, and that is actually shaping how easy it is for you to change your behavior. And related to how motivated you are and how easy it is for you to change your habits.
Can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
I just want to tell you that we don't have too much time left before we go to the Q&A. So I just want you to know that.
Sure. I'll go fast. So that was the first question. When you want to change people's behavior, is to take into account their situation and not just their cognitive and social obstacles or barriers like I've shown before. And of course, this situation where you live and when you grew up also interacts with your cognitive ability and interacts with your cognition. And you have studies in cognitive science trying to see the effect of social capital, for instance, on your on cognition, or the effect of the type of environment where you lived, and how it affects your, let's say, life strategy. So that's a theory called life history theory, if you want to look at it. Of course, I will give you the PDF of the presentation afterwards. All the references will be there if you want to go deeper. A second question is not just what is the margin of action of the people you want to change the behavior, but also what type of behavior. And if you're a policymaker and you want to reduce the carbon footprint of French citizens, you have to think about how you're going to allocate your energy and resources. And one question is, if I have few money and I want the Parisian population to reduce its average carbon footprint, who should I target first? And when and where, and what type of behavior? So there is here some optimization to be done. And I think taking into account the individual perspective could help decision makers to actually make that choice, which they don't always do, if any. And one is the who. And here I've shown you a study that shows a correlation in between, so it's the US, the amount of CO2 emitted per person and their average income. And you see that the richer someone is, the higher is carbon emission, or the carbon emissions. And if you want to reduce the average carbon footprint of someone, of the French population, one way to do it will be actually to change the behavior of the people who are emitting the more, CO2, and therefore the people who are richer, according to this study. You could have other criteria, but at least that's one way to think about this issue. And that is not what is done in France, at least. When we target some behavior, usually those are not the behavior of the richer part of the population. So this is the who. So this is just an example, of course, but questioning who has the highest impact. And if I had to change the behavior of, let's say, like 1% of the population, who will be this 1% of the population? The second question is, where and when should someone change? Because of course, if you take someone like me, I have my carbon footprint is at home when I cook, when I travel around. It also when I'm a tourist and I go on vacation, and therefore I have an impact on the environment where I don't live, but where I'm being a tourist. I have also an impact on my workplace, so where I work, the way I consume, how I go to work, for instance. So each of us has actually different roles. And usually when we think about behavior change, we think about like lay people in their consumption behavior at home, at household, not at the workplace, or not much at the workplace, and not much on like clubs or associations you're part of, not much about the neighborhood you live in. So you have to think also about what type of behavior in what role. And the third part of this question, what behavior, is what specific behavior you want to change. And if you focus, for instance, on recycling behavior, and according to the pyramid of zero waste, it's not the most efficient to actually reduce plastic consumption. The most efficient would be to push people to actually refuse plastic, to consume less plastic, and not just let them consume plastic and then recycle the plastic, because the plastic which is actually recycled and reused is a small portion of the plastic which is consumed. So if you want to reduce plastic consumption and plastic pollution, you have to focus on what type of behavior will be the more efficient given the general goal that you have. So that was the second question. What type of behavior? I skipped this. It's just a study I find quite interesting that shows that for the average carbon footprint of one French citizen, which is 10 ton equivalent CO2 per year for now, the goal for the Paris Agreement will be to reduce that to an average of 2 tons, which is a lot. So you have to divide by 5 the average carbon footprint. If you take the different, like buying secondhand, consume locally, so pro-environmental behavior, if for someone which is heroic, you could reduce that carbon footprint by 2.5 tons maybe. Quite easily, no economic investment. Then you could add some investment, changing your heating system, renovating your building. This is still at the individual level, but it's not something you can do without investing. But if you combine the two for some ambitious individual action, as they call it, then you could reach a reduction of 4 tons of CO2 per year. But there is still some 6 tons and therefore 4 tons to reduce, which is independent of individuals, which depends on the system in which they live. So the social-technical structure I've talked about before. So if you buy food, how much your food, even if there is no package and it's no meat, etc., the carbon footprint of your food will depend on the food industry. And therefore, this is not in your power to reduce this carbon footprint. It is in the power of the supply chain that is behind the food production. And I think this study is quite interesting to see that at the individual level, you have some margin of action, but it is limited. And you have to think also about changing the system that is providing us with transport infrastructures, providing us with goods, with food, and so on. And here you can actually think about the behavior, but the behavior, the behavior of the people that are composing this system. I'm just going to skip that quickly. If you think about, for instance, plastic pollution, you could think about reducing plastic pollution by targeting the end consumer, so you and me buying a bottle of plastic, but you could think about the other stakeholders, the other people in the chain, which are taking part of the whole supply chain that is causing the plastic pollution. And this is WWF that talked about that. I mean, the first time I read that, at least, is to say that if you want to change in society to be achieved, You can do it through individual change if it is thoughtfully managed by targeting the right people. So it could be CEOs, it could be elected mayors, it could be CEOs of petrochemical companies, CEOs of companies using the plastic that they buy. Anyway, the right people in the right organization, using the right approach could be key to induce systemic change. So basically, you could think about changing behavior, not just of consumers, but changing behavior of people that are actually that have in their hand the power to change the way industry is made, the way agriculture is done, and that is part of the carbon footprint, which is not in your hands. So I skip that quickly. I put it some studies that came out recently that make the same point. If you want to check it out, it's quite interesting. But that led to the fourth question of what scale and scope, and how do you think about change, and how do you think about individual change with this systemic change? So I was going to skip towards the end. A 5 question is not just about margin of action of individuals, not just about what type of behavior, not just about who should we target, not just about how you think about change and the interaction in between the different people in the chain or in the system. A 5 question is about what types of lever or means of actions people already have to actually push those people to change. And here we have several projects where we try to help one local governance or a city to do citizen participation, to think about how to change the whole meat production in their territory. We use cognitive science in order to improve collective decision-making, improve dialogue among producers, among consumers, among people sending away the meat in big mold, for instance. And so all the people are taking part of the impact of the whole meats production industry, from producer to consumer. There are ways to actually make them work together in order to find some ways to reduce the whole impact of the whole chain. And so we use cognitive science here, not just to push people to change their practice, push producers to change the way they produce meat, change consumers the way they consume meat, but also how together they could actually come up with better ideas and more ambitious plans of action for the whole chain. So in that case, we're not targeting the practices, we're targeting the means to actually get to a solution which is more impactful in terms of changing, reducing the impact of the meat production. I take 2 minutes for my third point and I stop here. So we saw how we could use cognitive and behavioral science to increase the impact of environmental action and policies. How it can contribute to develop more adjusted and efficient strategies by thinking about individual change more thoughtfully and moving away from changing lay people consuming behavior, but to really think about how we could start from the individual and go up to changing some systems of production, thinking about behavior and individual behavior. And at some point is to provide new perspectives on ecological transition. I'm gonna just put one slide here, which is one lesson that we got from working with policymakers and people on the field, is that usually, so one hypothesis why behavior is not taken into account when they develop these strategies to reduce our environmental impact. One hypothesis that Sojo said is because of the political nature of lifestyle changes. So they say governments or NGOs, they don't want to talk about lifestyle changes and they don't want to push people to change their behavior because it's tricky in terms of politics. It's tricky in terms of ethics. And they have this example of the French Ministry of Ecology with the mitigation scenario, when they said they were careful in its communication to avoid any expression that might suggest a trade-off in terms of comfort or affluence loss, and also considered an intensity and a scope of lifestyle changes restricted to the most consensual practices and changes. So basically, in the scenario, they don't want to be too hard, to push too hard on people because they're afraid of their reaction. So that's one explanation why usually lifestyle changes and behavioral changes is neglected. I think it's not enough. And I think from what we've seen before, one other explanation, one other hypothesis is that all the people that are thinking about these issues, they have a really simplistic representation or understanding on how behavior works and how the mind works and what shapes people's behavior. So that relates to this concept in cognitive science, which philosophy of mind, which is called false psychology. So the people who are thinking about the transition issues, ecological transition issues and challenges, they go for the technical solution. They avoid really deep behavioral changes and to go deep into the lifestyle changes because they don't really know how behavior works and what could be done and how to implement this knowledge about the human component into account. And that relates to a concept an idiom in Quebecan, I think, which is the human factor. And it's called, so in English, I guess it's something like the fucking human factor. And this astrophysicist, which is famous, he says, when we go, the guy says, why do you think people don't change? And why do you think we have trouble to reduce our environmental impact? And he says it's because of this human factor. And so the idiom in French, at least it's funny, but I think it says something. It says that usually when people think about that, they don't really know how to think about behavior. They don't really know how to think about behavior change. And therefore, they just put that in the category of, oh, that's the human factor. Let's focus on what we master. Let's focus on the technology, on the economics. And the human factor is something that it's something we leave for later. And I think one contribution you could make is not just to help decision makers to improve their decision making, their actions, not just help them to think more thoughtfully about the strategies. It's also to give them some knowledge and understanding of the human behavior, so they will come up themselves with some new ideas about how to actually tackle those big issues. And the human dimension, I think, is also overlooked because of lack of expertise. So people thinking about that don't have training in psychology, don't have training in sociology. So they just go with they know what to do. And I think one role we have, at least at the ACTE Lab, is to try to cast doubt on folk wisdom, to take the word from Maurice Bloch, and to make sure that people that are thinking about the human behavior are less wrong in the way they think about the human behavior. And we could actually open new roads to take into account this human factor in order to really tackle the lifestyle changes of the ecological transition. Yeah, I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a lot of really interesting information.